Okay, happy Monday. Oh, let's get started. We are coming into classical Greece this week. And so here's your bell ringer. And let you set up and do that. All right, so let's talk about last week and how we connect to this week. The Minoans came from Crete, which is part of which modern day country? It is, of course, Greece. Yay, which is where we are continuing. Okay, so what is classical Greece known for? It's known for mainly its pottery, and we have its pottery and its columns and its wonderful sculpture. So we're going to start with pottery. We have 4 types of Greek pottery, and they're divided into these 4 sections: the proto-geometric, the geometric, the black figure, and the red figure. And you have examples of those on your screen. So you can tell the proto-geometric is very, very, very simplified. Just bands of color, circles, just very, very, very simple. And this was developed about 1000 BC. They got a little more complicated about 100 years later with their geometric pottery. And you can see that this is the pot that is next to it that has a little bit more complicated designs. This one has figures on it as well, but mostly on one of those wonderful motifs that we think about with the Greeks, that repetition of pattern as it goes through, the bands of pattern that we see so often in Greek pottery and in Greek motifs and Greek clothing and all that kind of stuff. These, although they were developed after each other, they did exist, especially the geometric and the black and red figure. They existed all at the same time. So people are making this pottery all together. It just depends on what somebody wants. So even though new styles are coming out, the old styles are still being used. We still see pots from those other styles still popping up through this period. Probably some of the most famous pottery, when we think about Greek pottery, we think about black figure pottery. It's where you have that strong image of the black figures on the red background. And I think that's really the most iconic image. You can see that one on this pot here. And when we think about Greek pottery, that's, I think, what most often comes to mind. It was followed much later by red figure pottery, which gave the artist a little bit more ability to develop the figure as a little bit more detailed. With black figure, there's only so much you can do other than make the outline of the figure and some of the basic facial features. You can't really get too involved, whereas the red figure would allow, and here it looks almost a little bit more what you would think of as almost like a tan figure. It doesn't look a real strong red, but we were going to call this red figure. And they are much, much more detailed. And you can see the figures, you can see bits of their clothing and their hair bands and things like that. So you can see that it's developing a much, much more detailed style for the potter. Here's some more examples of geometric pottery. You can see the repetition of design. Here's some more black figure. There's a minotaur, and I want to say this is Ajax at the table. This one, I used the same image here to show you sort of the red. If you come back and see this one right here, it's the black figure, and also then here the red figure, almost the same pot as it were, but you can see the much richer detail on the second pot. You can get a lot more facial features, a lot more features in their musculature, their armor, things like that. All right, classical Greece was also known for its statues. When we think about Greece, we really think about that black figure pottery, but also all of the wonderful statues. They use several different methods. They're actually their most common method that we find, the most material that we find the most often is the bronze. Almost half of all of the statues from the period are bronze. Although that's not really what we think about when we think about Greek statues. We really think about the marble, the stone statues. And that's because most of the statues that were bronze, and actually most of the statues from the period in general, were lost. And the Romans came and they recast and they copied the Greek statues, and they were all done in marble. And so you see that that is the most common image that we see now, are these replicas of the original bronzes. But they also used terracotta, they also used wood. The final surface was most often colored or gilded with gold, painted, somehow given that life on top of it, very much like you see in the Egyptian world. They even coated it with oil and hot wax, things like that, just to make it look a little more lifelike. The very first statues that we see coming out of the period are the Koroi, or the Korokos. These were freestanding statues. They could stand on their own. They were not attached to a wall or to some kind of gate, things like that that we see a lot in the Babylonian world and in the Assyrian world. We have freestanding statues. They are almost always male. They're almost always nude. And that's because they were very much interested in how close, for many years, how close can we get to the actual human physique. And so clothing would have sort of disguised this and would have given the Greeks not really as much opportunity to show their skills and the way that they could develop the muscles or develop the joints and so forth. And so they preferred the nude. This also let them show a kind of movement, and you can already see where they're attempting to do a little bit of movement here, where the one foot is in front of the other just slightly. Just even though the arms are held very rigidly at the side, you can see that they're trying very hard to get out of that and break out of that. And that's what makes it a little bit different than what we see in Egyptian sculpture up until this point, which is very, very rigid. Let's look at a bit of a progression of this. You can see here in 630 BC, the Lady of Auxerre, you have something that is very, very rigid, very, very straight. The block underneath her is almost seems like almost the same as her dress. It's very, very linear. And then you can see here the chorus here. They are trying to create that movement, that one little foot that's just a little bit forward. Then in 530 BC, you see the Peplos Kore, where she is a little bit more. You still see her pretty rigid, but she's trying to pull her arm out a little bit, things like that. You can see much more development in the face with this piece as opposed to the one 100 years earlier. This one almost looks Egyptian. The Lady of Auxerre, where she's the Peplos Kore, looks very very rounded in the face. You can see they're really kind of getting away from that Egyptian statue. And finally, you see in 480, one of the most famous ones is the Critias boy, and he is got this wonderful liveliness to him, and you can see that the Greeks are developing their sculpture over the course of this period. They're really, really trying to mimic what a human being looks like. They're trying very, very hard to get it all right and put everything in the right place and where are the muscles, and they're studying the body very closely. And you see that reflected. Important word that I want you to remember is contrapposto, and let's see what that is. All right, it means counterpoise or counterpose, and here you can see that the hips and the shoulders are sort of slanted. So we're going to put most of our weight standing on one foot. That's going to create a bit of a bent knee, and so you're standing. You have a bit of a bent knee, and it creates this wonderful asymmetrical balance where it's just a little like sassy, like, let me just like here stand a little bit diagonal. Just, it puts a little bit of movement in. And I don't know if you remember from, if you were in my class last semester, we're talking about lines and talking about diagonal lines and how diagonal lines create that movement. And you see that very much here, that it's not just up and down and straight. It's got a bit of a style to it, a bit of a flair, and it's harder. It's much harder to do. And you can tell just in your own drawing, and you look in your own work, and how it's so easy to do a little stick figure with very, very straight limbs, but the minute you start to sort of counterpose it or bend it a little bit, it creates a little bit more difficulty. And that's what the Greeks are doing. They're just creating something that's a little bit more lifelike. Well, that's what they're trying to accomplish here. And there's just a cute little cartoon for you that I thought was cute. Because the Greeks and the Egyptians were always borrowing off of each other. There's this wonderful Egyptian grave in which it belonged obviously to either somebody who was of Greek origin and came over, or was just very, very influenced by the Greeks. And it's this wonderful meshing of the two cultures. And you see some attempts at the Greek and then also some attempts at the Egyptian. And you just see so much interchange between these two cultures. And, you know, the Greeks took the Egyptian ideals and they took it a little bit differently. They just had a different take on things. Okay, here's a really great example of Contrapposto. And this is by the sculptor who actually developed first of it. They think that he probably was the one that first developed this pose where you're standing on most of your weight on one foot, and that's sort of just a little bit of a turn in the shoulder, a turn in the hips. And this is called the spear bearer. Oh, I put BC twice. I'll fix that. All right, other famous statues. This one is lovely, the Charioteer of Delphi, and you can see in bronze here. And so this is the original and not a copy. And just the lifelike statue, especially for this time period. You can see even the eyes and the almost like the eyelashes in the eyes. All the little tiny little curls in their hair as they come up and around the ear and so forth. Just really, really lovely detail. The drape of the clothing, all of that. Okay, this one's also one that you see quite often. The disc thrower, or the discobolus. Now this is a Roman copy. It was originally in bronze. But showing too that the Greeks really, really valued athletes. They really, really valued the athleticism, and the body. An athlete's body was the ideal body. This one is Hercules, and a really great slouching figure as he drapes his arm over what is a lion that he has conquered, his pelt, and so forth, and just massive. You can see here that, you know, it almost reminds me a little bit of modern day comic books. You know, just the gods were so much more than life. At some point around this period, the Greeks have almost mastered what they think is the perfect person, and then that is exactly like what the human figure looks like, right? Exactly human proportions, exactly right. And then you see at that instance they start to break away and they start to go into something that is above and beyond human. It's more than human. So they're stopping trying to make a perfect copy of what a human being looks like, and instead make their ideal human what they want a human to look like, or what they want a god to look like, or a demigod to look like in the case of Hercules. And so let's just give him these massive muscles that are just huge. Let's make him taller than he really normally would be, much, much bigger and stronger, because it's Hercules, and so we need to make him huge and amazing. And you see that very much here. Here is an interesting sculpture from the period, and it is called the modest pose, because this Aphrodite, unlike some of the earlier Aphrodites who were shown with very, very, very large hips and very, very large, over-exaggerated features, because she's Aphrodite. In this case, this particular sculptor from the period, Praxiteles, I think is how you say his name, decided that she needed to be a little bit more like a regular woman. And so he made her a little bit smaller and less exaggerated. And he put her hand right there to, you know, cover up her little private part. And so she's called the modest pose, because she's covering up. And this is something that you see a lot of other people try to emulate after this. She's very influential. Because once they see this, they're like, oh, I like that. She looks real modest. She looks real lifelike. Let's do that. And so you had a lot of copies of her in this pose. much like the Contrapposto. And still she is Contrapposto as well, as you can see that she's standing on